Have you ever wanted to know the future? To have special knowledge from God about what's going to come to pass in the coming years? If so, why? What's your reasoning? I mean, it might seem fun or fanciful to think about being able to know the future. You ever read a book of fiction or seen a movie about that before? But realistically, knowing the future or thinking we know the future is potentially damaging. Knowledge of the future is not a cure-all for our current situation. In fact, such knowledge could easily make things worse rather than better. As soon as we believe we know the future, that knowledge changes us. It changes our actions and our ideas. If we think the future is bright, we're going to act a certain way, right, in optimistic ways. But if we think our future is bad, we may act in other ways, right? We may be desperate or questionable ways. I've seen this effect in my own life. When I was a teen, we were told that the world was coming to an end soon. You remember that? Still hear it, I know. I heard this prediction in the 70s from many sources. I heard from Christians that disasters foretold in the Bible, in Revelation, would soon come to pass. The end is near. I heard from the government that nuclear holocaust was a very real possibility, that our use of nuclear bombs was likely to cause the end of the world very soon. All these predictions of the world coming to an end caused me to be more cynical and to make some bad choices in my youth. I wonder what my life would have been like if I had trusted God with the future as I was growing up, rather than trusting in the predictions of the end, which I eventually learned to trust in God, and here I stand. So it turned out okay. But seriously, this really impacted my youth. I did some stupid things because the world was going to end anyway. I trusted these predictions of the end times, and that was a mistake. All the talk and focus on the end times has likely impacted all of us in different ways. It impacts how we read the Bible. It impacts how we approach life in general. In modern times, the book of Revelation has been presented and held up as a pending and certain reality, as a prediction of the near future. And that's troubling for a whole lot of reasons. First, focusing on the future like that violates Christ's teachings, his instructions to seek God in the present moment. It's also troubling because focusing on a future of destruction tends to be self-fulfilling at both the individual and the societal level, and leads to people making poor choices based on a cynical appraisal of life. But it's also troubling because it's not even really clear that the end times is what the book of Revelation is even about. The book of Revelations is a very difficult book to wrap our heads around. We might assume we understand it because in addition to what we have heard in church about it, which is probably not a lot necessarily, the book of Revelation or certain elements of it get talked about frequently in pop culture. But like a lot of books in the Bible, understanding the original context of the book of Revelation is helpful. First, the book of Revelation comes to us from a time when the measure of faith for Christians was not belief in Jesus as we think of it today. It wasn't about holding or professing certain beliefs. Instead, back then, faith was measured by someone's willingness to publicly identify as Christian, despite the dangers, even to the point of martyrdom and death. In other words, the book of Revelation came out of a social and historical situation that's totally foreign to people like us. We live in an empire where Christianity is the norm, the most powerful faith in our society. The book of Revelation was written by people who were on the opposite side of empire, people who were suffering a dire situation of drastic oppression and death. And so this book comes to us from the perspective of the victims of empire, not the victors like us, for the most part, what we represent today as Americans. Also, unlike most of the rest of the Bible, Revelation is full of images of symbols, often violent, and magical creatures with many heads, many eyes, and yes, there be dragons. The book of Revelation is not like anything else in the New Testament. It's not the product of tradition or the articulation of an argument or of a theology. It's the product of a vision or a dream, which means it's loaded with ancient symbolism that can easily be misunderstood in today's world. So when actually digging in and reading the book of Revelations today, we bring with it a lot of preconceived ideas that would not have been present in the minds of the original audience of this work. When we read the book of Revelation today, our minds are not in tune with ancient understandings. Instead, our minds are full of information from movies and books and TV shows, from things like Left Behind series, or maybe Good Omens, or what we hear from popular end-time preachers on TV or on the internet. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine, though, how much we've been impacted by messages in our culture that exploit our spiritual ignorance and fear by pretending to disclose explosive contents of the book of Revelation in order to make a lot of money for themselves. And as a result, for many of us, what we think we know about the book of Revelation has been twisted by these modern ideas, by these misunderstandings. It's even led many of us to read the entire Bible through this sort of lens, like it's a best-selling novel leading up to a grand climax of future disaster and destruction. But historically, the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, has not been understood in terms of the end times as we think of it today. There are several different ways that Christians have tended to think about the book of Revelation over the years. One is that the book of Revelation is about the fall of the Roman Empire, not about the end of the world as we know it today. Time-wise, this book was written shortly after the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed by Rome, when Christians were being rounded up and killed by the forces of empire. In this view, most of the predictions and advice was for people who died thousands of years ago. To those folks who were facing oppression, this book would have offered comfort by communicating that being killed for the sake of Jesus Christ is not the end of the story. Others historically have seen this book as being about the internal spiritual battle that many of us have to wage in the process of our own personal spiritual growth, our own internal battles with evil, about the human struggle that many of us deal with as we grow closer to Christ. In this view, the book of Revelation does not describe the end of the world as much as it describes the periods of struggle that finally end as we sit at Christ's feet. As for the timing of what the imagery describes, in several places in Revelation, the writer says that these things are going to happen very soon. Soon as measured from the time this book was written. And that has led many to interpret these visions as symbolic representations of first century wars and tragedies. The difficult nature of this book, particularly its violent symbolism, has made it very controversial throughout Christian history. Several early church fathers, 100 AD, 200, very early, did not want this book as part of any sort of Christian tradition. They did not believe it was written by the Apostle John, but by another John. Revelation was the last book of the Bible to be accepted by the Western Church, maybe around 400 AD. Doubts about the book of Revelation continued and resurfaced during the 16th century Protestant Reformation. In 1522, Martin Luther rejected Revelation, calling it neither apostolic nor prophetic, only to change his mind 8 years later with a more favorable assessment. Other reformers of the 16th century felt that Revelation should not be considered biblical. John Calvin, the father of the Presbyterian and Reformed traditions, did not even bother to write a commentary on it. Meanwhile, the Eastern Church rejected the book of Revelation until about 500 years ago. To this day, the Eastern Orthodox Church does not include Revelation readings in their worship services, ever. And frankly, Catholics and most Protestants include it rarely as well. To me, this history does not mean that the book of Revelation should be rejected, but I think it makes sense to consider interpretations of it in light of this uncertain history. For example, if we have trouble understanding the book of Revelation, we can take comfort knowing that we're in good company. This history also reminds us to be wary of those who claim to know what Revelation means, and to be careful to consider any such claims as one possibility of many. Still, once we come to terms with our limited ability to understand the otherworldly symbolism of Revelation, I think there's still much to be gained from reading this book of the Bible. Today's reading, for example, draws this picture of a great multitude of saints from every nation standing and singing before God's throne. They seem to be the same group from the previous chapter that were crying out in agony, that were being slaughtered for the word of God. It's a group of people who were persecuted, who were martyred, who are now singing hymns of praise. There's so many of them, they cannot be counted. It's an inclusive group. We are told they come from everywhere, from every race, every tribe, every nation, and every language. They are everybody, and they sing. It's what the faithful do. This is a pattern in the book of Revelation. There's pain, suffering, death, and then thanksgiving in anticipation of a time when hunger and thirst will be no more, and every tear will be wiped away by God. Even in the midst of evil, of war, of social upheaval, and violence or greed, the faithful cannot stop from singing. Through sickness, persecution, extreme weather, death, state-sponsored injustice, those things confront us, and the faithful cannot help but to continue to sing. The faithful both sing and listen. Salvation belongs to our God and to the Lamb. Salvation does not belong to empire, to worldly powers, but only to God. The final word of this particular chapter of Revelation is that God will not only protect us from future sufferings, but will comfort those who endured suffering in the past. Even if the sufferings of most present-day readers cannot be compared to those of early Christian martyrs, this is still something we can take comfort in. That Christian hope is found not in repeating crucifixions, but in putting such suffering to an end. That Christian hope is found even in the book of Revelation. That Revelation ends not with total destruction, but with God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. In the description of a glorious new city on earth. Okay, this new city is huge. It's described as being 1,400 miles long, 1,400 miles wide, and 1,400 miles high. To this day, no city on earth has ever reached this size, not even close. I mean, this would be a city basically as big as the distance between Owosso and Denver. The scripture says that this new city would be open. The gates would never close. And inside this new city, it would be daylight always. And nothing unclean would be welcome. Among marginalized communities, this sort of otherworldly spirituality or spiritual vision, like we see in the book of Revelation, has sustained hope for radical renewal even when no signs of change were evident. On the other hand, for the powerful and the privileged, an otherworldly spirituality like this can function very differently. Otherworldly spirituality in a privileged community too often allows the faithful to opt out of any sense of responsibility to care for the earth or for other people, to feel like all they need to do is have the right beliefs and just go sit around and wait for Jesus to return. That's the other concern I sometimes have when people talk about the book of Revelation. If our focus on end-time theology gets in the way of loving our neighbor and having a heart for the poor today, if it thwarts our desire to help others escape suffering and pain today, then we may well be on the wrong side of the teachings of this book and the Bible as a whole. Because from an overall biblical perspective, Revelation is not about revealing the future so much as it is about revealing God in the present moment. The bigger message of the Bible and of Jesus' teachings is that God, that love is best found now in the present. We can totally miss that point if we focus on whether or when the end times are coming. The Bible tells us over and over not to worry about the future, and that no one knows when the end will come. During his famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." But we don't listen. We keep trying to decode the Bible. We buy those books, we watch those shows and other stuff because we want to know the future. We want to worry about tomorrow. That's just part of being imperfect humans, I guess. And maybe that's at least part of why God gave us a book at the end of our Bibles called Revelation. Because even though the word revelation means to reveal or to unmask, the book of Revelation is so veiled in symbolism that some ways it's the least revealing book of the Bible. I wonder that if God tells us the future, in some ways God would be taking away our free will, and that's just not something God is willing to do. Or that revealing the future violates God's plan, that we focus, that we search, that we find God and Jesus Christ in the present moment. So maybe the future must remain masked and in Revelation symbolism. And we see how God communicates something that is by its very nature must remain secret. Because God is love, and love is best experienced, is only experienced here and now, right now, by following the example of Jesus Christ, not by decoding and obsessing on predictions of disaster.